please welcome Dr. Bokar.
All right, so thank all of you for coming. I'm glad we got a nice turnout. I did not prepare a PowerPoint because I thought it might be more valuable to have more of an open forum so that those of you that had enough interest to show up on a Saturday morning at an event like this can actually have your individual questions addressed. So I'll start out by introducing myself and how I got to be the sickle cell doc at UH, and then open the floor to you guys to ask me questions, and we'll address them. And if there's somebody else on the panel that may be more appropriate for a question, we'll get them involved too. So I actually grew up here in Cleveland. I was born in Cleveland, went to school here, and during my medicine training, got exposed to patients with sickle cell disease. I'll never forget that as a third-year medical student, in the first 2 years of medical school, you pretty much spend most of your time in a classroom, which is far different from what you end up doing as a doctor, where you're interacting with strangers on a day-to-day basis. And you guys probably think we're something and comfortable dealing with people, but that's as scary as can be for some young kid, 20 years old, 22 years old, to walk into a room with somebody they've never met before and start to talk about very personal things. So when I was assigned to my first hospital rotation, on the first night, I was sent into a room with a patient to be his doctor. I've never been a doctor before, to go in and do an examination, take a history, and try and find out what was going on, and then come out and talk to the real doctors and come up with a plan as to how best to treat him. And it's interesting, this guy that I got assigned to happened to be a patient with sickle cell disease. And even having gone through medical school, I didn't really understand what sickle cell disease was. And here's me, this 20-something-year-old white kid, going into a room with a somewhat intimidating African-American guy who was about my age, a little bit older, who, not to be derogatory in any way, but seemed to have a chip on his shoulder. And my job is to go in there and help him. And for 3 days, I was his doctor, and I took what I thought was very good care of him. I went home and I opened the textbooks and I read about sickle cell disease and how do you manage pain in this patient population? What's all the word we use is pathophysiology, how does this affect the various organ systems in the body? And we seemed to get along pretty well. Didn't help that on top of it, he was almost deaf also, so there was a communication barrier. And on the third day, after I think, hey, I'm doing a pretty good job at this. This guy likes me, I like him, I'm learning about this disease. He seems to be improving a little bit. I must have done or said something, and this happens with all kinds of patients. It's not race, it's not disease. I did something or said something wrong that ticked him off, and this guy just blew up at me. And I'm like, I went out of the room almost in tears. And I'm like, what the heck is this? What did I do wrong? What did I say wrong? And in retrospect, I don't think I did anything wrong. I think that the treatment he had gotten over the years was such that he was very hypersensitive to people not addressing his needs in the right way. And he took it out on me that day. I don't think it was my fault, but he took it out on me. Well, the funny thing is, next year I'm a fourth-year medical student. I was doing hematology consults. I ended up seeing him again, and it was less intimidating now. Then I become an intern, and this was one of our patients that was getting admitted to the hospital extremely frequently. And as an intern, I took care of him 2 or 3 times that year. As a resident, I took care of him 2 or 3 times that year. I decide I'm going into hem-onc, and I'm assigned a clinic. My first day of fellowship, which is now 5 years later, well, it's 7 years after that first interaction as a medical student, I inherited another fellow's clinic who had just graduated the week before. So I had a patient population, some with cancer, some with hematologic disorders. I look at my schedule, who's the first patient? Unbelievable. So this guy's still my patient. And, I didn't choose to be a sickle cell doc. I ended up a sickle cell doc by accident. And I think the reason for that is that although this is an extremely important disease, especially in the African American community, it's not a real common disease. And we think it's common as doctors because we take care of patients almost every day with sickle cell disease. But in reality, as was told to us in the first talk, there's about 70,000 people in this country with sickle cell disease. That's not a lot. And I think because of that, there's a real lack of awareness from a physician's perspective on how best to take care of patients with sickle cell disease, in the community in terms of what the disease really is, which is why an organization like this is so great in helping to educate the community. Even the patients don't have a ton of resources like they do with other diseases. If a woman gets breast cancer, you go on the internet and search on breast cancer resources, you're going to get thousands and thousands of hits. There are all sorts of community organizations. There's all sorts of money. There's the Race for the Cure, the Walk for the Cure. Everybody's wearing pink ribbons. There's this incredible social support network for these patients, and they have a serious life-threatening disease. Our sickle cell patients have a serious life-threatening disease, and there's really no social support network for them. There's no education network. And I think that's one of our big challenges in, Kincaid's Kindred Spirits is helping to address that. But, those of you that are here, I really think it's important for you to help spread the word that organizations like this exist, to help the community better understand this disease. And I think if the community better understands it, then our community, our government, our hospitals will all provide more support to treatment and research for this disease, which is lacking. So I'm going to ask questions. How many patients with sickle cell disease do you guys think there are in Cleveland? Just take a wild guess. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but I have an answer. So that's pretty darn good. So you're at least in the ballpark. I think it's about 500, so it's less than 1,000, which is, again, not that common. And, as a white kid from Cleveland taking care of black people with a disease I was taught common in black people, I assumed that all black people knew about sickle cell disease. And by no means is that true. I think the African American community is just as uneducated as the Caucasian community. And is this a black disease? So it turns out it's not. I mean, it's a genetic disease, and the defective gene, and that's the best way to describe it, is carried in other populations too, as we were told. And I actually saw my first white patient with sickle cell disease about a month ago. It turns out to be a black disease and a black concern because the black community is mostly struck with this disease because of genetics, but by no means is it tied to race, intricately.
It just have SCD, regular sickle cell?
He actually had S-Thal, but S-Thal behaves almost the same as SS. But nevertheless, it illustrates this isn't a flat problem. This is a genetic problem that is carried in various populations around the world. It just happens to be that it's most prevalent in the black ethnicity, black genetics.